This special release podcast episode was originally recorded during the 2022 Beyond Clean Expert Series Conference, the industry's only 100% PowerPoint-free educational event. If you prefer to watch this interview, you can access it and over 200 other CE programs by visiting beyondclean.net. Thanks for listening and keep fighting dirty.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for yet another session in our Expert Series Conference. I am Melanie Perry. I am from Beyond Clean and also a co-host on the First Case podcast. Welcome to Session 6. It's called I Can See Clearly Now, Going Beyond the UDI Headlines to Real Implementation. And this has really been a fun day of learning. Thank you all for being here and for learning with us. As a reminder, in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll find many different links provided for you in the downloadable resources window, including links to access the anniversary giveaway and micro-credential. But now, the moment all of you have been waiting for, it is time for our anniversary code release. So, get your pens and pencils ready, pull out your phone to write a note, but our anniversary event code for this event is BLACK98. That's BLACK 98. So write that number down, write that code down, and then collect the other 3 codes for the month of April. You can find them in podcast episodes, our newsletter, Beyond Clean on LinkedIn and Facebook. And then once you have all 4 codes, visit beyondclean.net/anniversary to fill out the entry form. Good luck to all of you. I hope that you are able to collect all of those codes and participate in this giveaway. Now, to get on to our speakers for today's session, we're going to be talking to Ashlea Souffrou. She is the founder and CEO of ScanPro. She is also one of our power supply UDI implementation experts. In 2021, Ashlea was awarded a patent for her mobile application technology that extracts product data from a medical device by scanning the UDI barcode. Also joining us today is Guillermo Ramas. He is the founder and CEO of Notisphere. He is a power supply medical device recall expert. Guillermo is a serial intra-entrepreneur with 24 plus years of healthcare technology experience. He prides himself in designing, developing, and taking to market innovative solutions that address industry-wide problems. And joining us again for another session is Justin Poulin. Welcome back. He is the founder and CEO of Beyond Clean. Justin is the host of several healthcare podcasts, including the Beyond Clean podcast, which focuses on important topics, trends, and innovations in sterile processing. His other podcast projects include First Case, that I'm also a part of, also Power Supply and Transmission Control. So with our presentation today, we are going to look at many of us have heard of unique device identification, but what does that have to do with our day-to-day in surgical services? Also, today's panel will identify unique device identification and how it pertains to surgical services and discuss the role frontline technicians play in UDI requirements. And they're also going to outline the cost savings and quality improvements that UDI provides to healthcare organizations. And with that introduction and broad outline, I'm going to hand it over to Justin, Ashlea, and Guillermo, and y'all take it away for a very engaging discussion.
Thank you, Melanie. And I'm also going to add in, we shuffled the deck a little bit with our panel discussions because, and we're going to talk about this as we go along here, but earlier this week, we got an announcement from the FDA talking about final recall guidance and very much that it did not require unique device identifiers to be included in that. So we also are going to be talking in depth about medical recalls, which is, Guillermo, we pulled you out of our data version of this conference and pulled you into the UDI conversation very much for that reason. And so I do want to introduce you both, but one of the things that I think sets the two of you apart in the industry is your passion. You've obviously participated in the Power Supply Expert Series. You both have been guests on podcasts, prior educational episodes of the Power Supply podcast, and your passion for what you do and launching your companies and businesses to solve healthcare problems really shines through very strongly. So I'm going to start with Ashlea. And Ashlea, I'd like you to just tell the audience, why is UDI so important to you? And then we'll come circle back around and maybe get some definitions to set a baseline for the conversation today.
Yeah, I've been having that conversation a lot lately, and I'll share that it's important because for the last 10 years that I've been focused on hospital overstock, hospital waste, reducing expired inventory, the number one reason for all of these problems is it's manual. How am I supposed to have visibility into this if I have to manually write things down? And UDI enables us to leverage technology to quickly capture this type of data, to capture the UDI, to have visibility into 20 plus different types of data points that can be used in various different ways throughout the hospital.
So much conversation on power supply about data in general. And I think a lot of that has to do with trying to leverage that and also create some automated processes that are much more efficient. We talked earlier about the workforce shortages that are hitting the entire industry and even outside of healthcare pretty substantially. And the ways that we're going to be able to address that is by reducing manual processes that are repetitive and somewhat mundane. And something that we talked about on the earlier panel too was that would improve morale and people would feel more productive in their day-to-day, and that culture would help drive the industry forward. And so this is a common link between what you're talking about and the medical device recall world, Guillermo. And I want you to kind of jump in and talk about your passion because, again, trying to manage these notices and manage recall alerts is pretty time-consuming in many cases. And you're out there to solve sort of making that a more efficient process. So why do you care, and how did you stumble upon medical device recalls, alerts, and managing that?
Justin, what I look at and what Ashlea looks at kind of goes hand in hand, right? And you are right in saying that data is behind most of it, or a big part of it. For me, the key was understanding that the entire industry today is suffering from a process where everybody is unhappy and everybody is exerting an enormous effort, yet not feeling like the outcome of it is actually great. We still have a ton of patients that are affected by recall products. We have a lot of frustration. So when I started seeing that the industry in general, right, both sides of the industry, if you will, or the three sides, right, the providers, the suppliers, the patients, right, they were all suffering from pain points that are caused by the same source. At the end of the day, it's the same cause or the same reason that causes all this to happen. I figured this was a great opportunity to make a huge impact in the industry, and make a big difference by coming up with one solution that can help in that aspect, right? At the end, what ends up happening, obviously, is I end up chatting with Ashlea saying, we're working on very same missions with different parts of this process and different parts of the activity and solving additional pieces of frustration that happen along the way in this, pretty lengthy workflow that healthcare definitely needs to be involved in, right?
So our audience today is made up of a number of clinicians and folks from supply chain, but also sterile processing and the operating room. And so they may or may not have any involvement with medical device recalls, or they may or may not have had exposure to UDI or unique device identifiers. And so I'm going to come back and ask you to talk about what is the current process for medical device recalls. What does that look like, current state, and what is the clinician involvement in that process? Do they have any at all?
That's a great question. I think some of it will vary, but you're hitting on something that I think is pretty important. A lot of folks that don't work hands-on recalls in say a provider space are very unaware of the challenges that this actually presents to providers. It's interesting that if you talk to surgeons, for example, they'll tell you Well, I know there's recalls, obviously, and the organization takes care of this and deals with it. And so they assume the process works. And obviously the organization's doing everything they can to take care of recalls and react to them and execute on them, et cetera. Those folks are really not understanding the challenges that the folks in supply chain, risk management, value analysis are facing today when having to execute on recalls. The process is paper-based, and that's something that surprises a lot of folks, right? Including patients. So when you talk to people that are outside of healthcare and you explain to them, listen, if you have a hip implant, here's how the process works when there's a recall. There's FedExes being mailed to the hospital, et cetera. They scratch their heads, right? They look at you kind of going, seriously? That can't be right. But it is. And then once that paper reaches the hospital, there's an entirely different type of challenge, which is then today understanding, did I actually buy this item? Where is it? How do I find out if I still have it or if I've used it? What inventory locations do I have it, et cetera? What I will say, just to add to all this, is some clinicians are very painfully aware of how the process works, because in some organizations you end up sending nurses, for example, right, to check on inventory locations, et cetera, for product. And in those cases, unfortunately, given the process that we have in place today in the industry, what that means is anywhere from 50 to 95% of the times they're being asked to do this, it won't actually apply to them, right? They're doing it unnecessarily. They're doing it because the process is inefficient the way it's working today. So if you, and I think you and I have talked about this once, Justin, I mean, if you're a nurse, you went to med school, not to, to nursing school, not to deal with inventory locations necessarily. You want to treat patients. So every time you're getting asked to go check a shelf, the frustration probably just keeps growing a little bit, right? So I like to think that we're working to make all these people happy and save patients from being exposed to these kind of faulty products, right?
Yeah, and you're right. Clinicians don't want to be pulled away, from delivering patient care. And so that's really where they want to be focused. And, another thing that sort of connects you and Ashlea, and I know the two of you have referenced the overlap and sort of your common mission from different angles. But another one is the fact that medical device recalls impact the supplier and the front lines, but their perspectives on the reasoning for doing it and how to do it and what their role is are very different from each other. And when we bring that back over to unique device identification, Ashlea, this is also similar. The purpose for UDI for the manufacturer may be very different, for what the front lines or the hospitals are going to be doing with that, but it still is connecting these two parties on opposite sides of the table, as they used to say. Ashlea, do you want to talk more about the application of unique device identification? I can tell you the sterile processing industry is probably even more well aware of UDI than maybe even the perioperative audience, mostly because there's some implications around being able to track instruments, to the patient, and some of that's been discussed as a possibility for it, not implemented today, but there's a whole host of other reasons, and really gaining an understanding of your inventory, to Guillermo's point about knowing what you have and where is it. Maybe you could talk about that and describe that in more detail for the audience.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think that part of, the whole purpose of UDI initiated because we wanted to be able to track serial numbers from implants into the EMR. And so when a product was recalled, especially with implants or mesh, which happens more frequently than any of us would like, we wanted to be able to track all the way down to the patient ID. But those are if the class 3 devices are the ones that are put into the EMR, but all the other devices aren't. And so when UDI was implemented and rolled out, and by the end of this year, all class 1 devices will be required to have UDI on it, it enables our hospitals to leverage their technology, whatever those technologies are, to scan in the UDI. And the UDI has your GTIN, but it also has your lot number, has your expiration date, has your serial number. And having all of that data built into one of your software systems allows you to do so much. I had a really great roundtable conversation last week with some supply chain leaders, and they brought up the car analogy, right? When we have a car that's a part on our car that's recalled, we get a letter from the manufacturer. The manufacturers today have absolutely no control over that. They have to notify the hospital that they sold the device to, for then the hospital to maybe 30 days later, and Guillermo knows that process better than I do. By the time that it's mailed, that it's received by the hospital C-suite or regulatory departments, risk departments, to the nurse or the techs that have to go pull the device, and then maybe they can look to see if that product was used. But if hospitals start leveraging UDI, they could, even when we're picking cases, we could scan that UDI down to the lot number and expiration date and start assigning those to cases. So we could essentially be able to start running reports to say, one, this is where this product is on our shelf. Two, and because we'll have visibility into lot number, right now nobody has that. That's probably a key piece that I forgot to say so far. But once we have that, then we could also run reports on these, on our ERPs or EMRs, depending on where we choose to load this information, to be able to backtrack and see, is this a critical device that we can go back and work with the patient on? And that piece of it's missing, and that's where there's so much opportunity with UDI that hasn't even been tapped into yet.
How would hospitals know their inventory today? Like, what's the current state for gathering and maintaining an inventory?
Yeah, they have. I mean, you're using a Lawson or a Cerner or Kess. There's lots of different inventory systems. And I'm speaking specifically from supplies, right? You have our biomed departments run their CMMS databases. Obviously, a lot of listeners on here understand how disconnected it is with sterile processing. There's 3 silos. So I'll answer the question on from the supplies perspective. For the supplies that are owned, and that's key, they're using one of their inventory systems. But once it's put onto the patient, or once it's put into a supply core, they know that they have 3 of this trocar, or they're supposed to, right? But what they don't know is the lot number. They don't know the expiration date. They don't know the serial number. There isn't a hospital today that you can walk into to say, well, I should say there's probably a few, but majority of hospitals can't tell you what's expiring on my shelf and go show me. They might sticker it for a short dated, but from a lot number, serial number specific to this question, as we're talking about recalls, they have to go hunt it down, and they have to physically look at every single box to see what lot number or serial number is associated with it. It isn't in a database.
Wow. And you talked about expiration. I can only imagine there's a lot of cost loss there. Products that are purchased that don't get used, that expire, and then essentially end up in waste. It's
estimated about $1 million of unused supplies per 500-bed hospital goes to waste. $1 million? Million.
Oh,
yeah, this is the part. This is how I got started with my business. I'm crazy passionate about it because there's so much opportunity, right? We look at our small community hospitals that could benefit from, can we transfer supplies or even visibility into one system, the amount of money that's just wasted from products that are used throughout the system, but because they have no visibility into expiration dates, they don't know what's going to expire. The top hospitals today, if they're managing it, are still managing it in a notebook.
Wow. So we've talked a lot about how technology is really going to have to be an area where we address this workforce shortage. We teed that up a little bit. But I want to ask an open-ended question, and so the two of you can feel free to riff on this and go back and forth. I certainly don't need to be in the middle of this one because I think there's a lot of meat on the bone here. What are the myths and misconceptions? We'll start with Guillermo, and we can talk about UDI and medical device recalls overlapping. What are some of the myths and misconceptions or misunderstandings or even just self-awareness gaps in this area? Guillermo, we'll start with you.
I would say, and actually just building on Ashlea's last few comments, when you think about it today, any supply chain group at a provider is working madly to deal with recalls that are coming in. And today, given the process that's in place, they get thousands of alerts a year. If you think about it, because approximately half of all of the recalls in the country are batch and lot. In reality, if they did have batch lot specific information, they would automatically have to stop. They could stop at least looking for 50 to 90% of those alerts, right? Because they could ignore them. And this is one of the things we focus on. So the first thing that I would say is a myth is there's not necessarily a need to look at PO history to determine if you're affected by a recall. That's what most hospitals are doing today, and it's actually not necessarily efficient, right? There are better ways of doing that. And the myth really is, or something that's a misconception is, the best data for that is not the hospitals, it's actually the manufacturers. The manufacturers do track batch and lot. They do know where stuff is being shipped, right? So that's one. I think the other piece is, like Ashlea was saying, if the provider was actually tracking batch and lot by using UDI, then the second piece would be for those recalls that do affect them, they would know immediately where those items are, as opposed to then still saying, okay, so here's a SKU, now let's go check every floor and every inventory location just in case, right? Because we need to look at all of them. So I would say that's one. And then secondly, I would say a big one is I think a lot of people in the industry are under the impression that the process to alert of recalls and to get the right people at the hospital to understand that something is recalled is fast when it's really not. If you look at the suppliers, many suppliers are under the impression that because they're FedExing overnight these alerts, that the hospitals are finding out about the recall immediately, and that's not the case. It takes an average more than 2 weeks for the right person at the hospital to figure it out. That's a national average, right? So that you'll have some that are better and some that are worse, but that's actually pretty bad.
Ashlea, what would you add to this?
I think a myth would be, I have a solution for this. Or maybe it's a misconception, probably is the better response. So when we talk with a C-suite, and Guillermo and I have actually had this conversation before, which is when we talk with a C-suite VP level, they're like, well, we manage our inventory. We just spent $40 million on this system. We have a process for how we manage our product recalls. And so I think that's such a missing piece between what the hospital from the C-suite level thinks is happening versus what is happening actually on the floor that the clinicians know is happening. So I would say that's probably, the biggest area where we see an opportunity. And that's where we're starting to actually see more conversations starting with, oh, I guess I don't have a solution for this. And there is a problem here. I also, would like to point out from the manufacturer side too, is when a big recall happens, hospitals look to their reps to say, okay, well, this is your product. This is your fault. Where you go, what am I supposed to do about it? And a lot of these supplies are in areas of the hospital that the reps aren't even privy to have access to. So how, besides running reports, can they help them if they don't even know, outside of saying, well, we shipped it here a couple of months ago, but they're not managing the inventory. That's not the piece of that's not their job, essentially. So I think that, there's definitely a gap there in how they can help each other. If the hospital isn't leveraging UDI and using technology to incorporate that data, down to the supply core.
I would add, Ashlea, that, and so yes, I think we were talking about this the other day, right? It's fascinating to me that you can hear people that openly tell you, well, I have a process for this. It's not great, but it's a process. And so I have other things I need to deal with, right? And for me, that, while I totally understand what they're trying to say, right, which is I have priorities and some things are very urgent today. But when you really think about it, if something is on priority slot number 6 and you're dealing with 5 things every year that you're saying I'm just going to knock out as special projects or whatever, and I'm simplifying obviously, and that number 6 stays on number 6 for 10 years in a row, that should never be a number 6 for 10 years, right? At that point, the length of time that's going by means that you should be at some point figuring out how to bring it up into the priority list. So that's one thing. I think that the other piece that is also it's fascinating to me, and I do think it's a misconception for many, is that they expect the rep at the supplier rep to actually know that they're affected by a recall, that particular provider is, when in reality they're not. What ends up happening is the rep a lot of times is one of the last folks to know, because they only get involved after their client, their account, says that they're requesting a credit, an exchange, etc. The group that alerts the hospitals is a separate group from sales. It's post-market and quality. And so what ends up happening, and for obvious reasons, there's a little bit of a firewall between these two groups at suppliers, right? You definitely want to have the folks communicating recalls separated a little bit from the folks that are just obviously focused on selling. But it happens quite a bit that, and we've had cases with providers that work with us that will reach out to a supplier rep saying, hey, we think we're affected by this recall, but you never alerted me. And the rep will say, no, I don't think you are, when in reality they are, right? So, and it's not the rep's fault. It's just the way the process is designed. But I think a lot of people assume that the rep will always have immediate information about all this, when in reality they don't. The silos are pretty big when it comes to, knowledge around specific recalls and accounts affected.
On the earlier discussion that we had, we talked about interoperability and all the different silos within the healthcare organization. I think that's the first time I've had a conversation with anyone talking about the silos that might exist on the manufacturer or supplier side. That's really great insight. I know a lot of people out there that's going to be one of their little nuggets that they're definitely going to take away today. Like, oh yeah, this is an organizational thing, not just a hospital thing or a healthcare organization thing. And there are reasons for operating in silos, but the transparency piece and the timing of communication and the expediency of that gets really impacted as a result of those silos. And also communication has to become much more intentional with all these different buckets that people are categorized into. I want to talk about regulatory, because we're touching on that. Recalls is kind of a regulatory guidance. I'm not going to dive into the FDA because I feel like that's our home run hitter to bring the two of you together, and we teased it at the start. I want to start with organizations like AAMI and AORN, and just to ask you, are there trade organizations like that or government organizations other than the FDA that are talking or have guidelines or best practices, recommendations around, and maybe we can start with recalls, but then also UDI?
Do you want me to start on this one?
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that one organization that just wasn't listed here, but I think is probably the one that's doing the most, is ARM. So they're the group that is advocating to the FDA for, and you touched on it, and it's something that I know we'll talk about, but the guidance of what we wanted in the recommendations to the FDA. So I would say ARM is made up of supply chain leaders, and so they're actively they've kind of taken the lead on this, I would say. So. They also have what's called the Learning UDI Committee, and they have all these different case studies that were done to provide the industry with why we should be implementing a standard barcoding system on supplies and the studies were done anywhere from 2014 to 2017, but they're all right on their website. And you can see all these different use cases, different scenarios that were done that show improvement on recalls, improvement on cost savings, improvement on just general process improvement. So that would be the one that I would say is the strongest organization that's taking the largest stand. Guillermo and I are both active within the ARM community. As far as AORN, I was just there 2 weeks ago, and they're definitely have some opportunities there as far as like education and saying, hey, this is what this barcode is, right? The nurses have to scan the barcode into into the records in the patient room. But there's a lot of opportunity too. I mean, we spent at our booth, it was busy the whole time, which was great, but most of the time was educating on what UDI is and all of the benefits. And the fact that I think, and that's something that's missing in this industry and where we need to have these organizations doing more, is on this education piece, which is, what is this UDI and how can I benefit from it? You know, I had nurses hugging me literally because they're like, wait a minute, you can scan this and it can give you visibility and expiration dates. I don't have to go checking for outdates. I've been a nurse for 40 years. Do you know how many times I've done that? And so, you know, I think that there's still, you know, a ways to go as far as, you know, teaching the industry, but having each one of these education groups really advocating for the use of UDI and how it benefits all their different areas, right? I mean, there's so many different benefits to leveraging UDI into the supply chain.
It really shouldn't be one, you know, organization's job to champion. To your point, we really need, especially as we're going to tie this in a minute, but if we want to influence, you know, really making that change and getting it into the guidelines that really impact hospitals and get people to fall into compliance, it's going to take more than just one organization to push that through. Guillermo, your thoughts on just other organizations before I just go ahead and bring this home on the FDA recall guidance from this past week?
You know, Justin, I think there's also, I would say there's some that are, you know, SMI comes to mind, you know, and there are folks that are very active in ARM that then also participate in SMI. And as you know, SMI has suppliers and providers in there, right? So there's been recommendations to the FDA that have come out of SMI to improve things like the recall process. I think you also see groups of providers just working together to try to understand this better and try to see what they can do on their own, right? The one thing that I would point out is, like Ashlea was saying, the awareness and the education piece of this industry-wide is sorely needed. When you think about the fact that suppliers today are sending, you know, millions and millions of FedExes all over the country to alert providers on recalls, and they need an acknowledgement back, right? Because that's the regulatory component that they need to meet, the compliance levels that they need to meet on these on this way to prove that the right folks have been alerted, right? The folks that received the affected product. When you talk to some providers, and I don't want to generalize because there are people that do this very well, but there's also many people that have actually told me, oh no, when we get the paper, we just throw it away because we're dealing with it on a different place or whatever. And they're not understanding that without that paper, the supplier can't actually accomplish their mission of proving to the FDA what they're after, which is alerting the right people. So the supplier keeps sending more and more and more paper. And the providers in the meantime are complaining about the amount of paper they get, right? So when you see that, what's happened is there's almost been a divergence between the different stakeholders in the industry into how they've interpreted what the problem is. And they've gone to act on trying to figure out ways to improve the process on their own. That's never going to result in a great result, right?
Yeah.
It's going to actually over time get worse and worse, which is what's happened in the last 7 years or so.
As volume increases.
Absolutely. Right now we have, I mean, it's exponential, the number of recalls we have. If you go back 15 years, there was probably 300 a year. And now it's in the thousands, right?
Wow. So we're hitting critical mass on this.
For sure. Yeah. It's expected that it's going to be a lot more now, right? Because they relaxed a lot of the requirements to put products out there during COVID, right? Because we had a shortage of supplies everywhere. And as you know, we've already had recalls that have popped up, even with things that were approved quickly to get it into the market, right? Just even basic supplies. So yeah, there's definitely, now that they're tightening back up again, there'll definitely be a rise.
All right, so let's bring this one home and tie the two of you as closely together as we possibly could, which is this FDA guidance, the final recall guidance. So it's interesting because the FDA has a lot of oversight and direction as it relates to medical device recalls and alerts and notices, et cetera, thus Notisphere. And at the same time, they left out this UDI component, which I think, Ashlea, you would agree is one of the key components to making this truly manageable. What are your thoughts on that?
What was so frustrating, I think, for the, and there were 50 people at least that were part of this from the ARM organization that worked together to write the recommendation. So this wasn't like 3 people in the room, and they from all areas of healthcare. The FDA is the one that mandated UDI, right? They were the ones that said, manufacturers, you need to put UDI because hospitals or providers need to be able to have visibility to lot numbers, expiration dates, and serial numbers.
10 years ago.
Right. Well, yeah, it started. That's when the conversation
right. It started. They started telling it was coming in 10 years. Right. Exactly.
So why would they not say to a manufacturer they have all of this information, right? Manufacturers know their UDI. Guillermo has alluded to that already. They have this information that it's part of their systems. They know where every box shipped based on the UDI. Why would they not require it to be part of the recall notices? And I think that just for those that are on this call that aren't familiar with how some of these submissions work, recall the way that a manufacturer can report a recall is completely inconsistent. They could say it's lot 1 through 27. They could say it's lot 1, 2, 3, 4. They can put different types of. They don't have to include all of these different types of information. If they included UDI as part of it, we would be able to quickly run, because clean data in, clean data out. And this is like part of, what, Guillermo's technology does. There's other technologies out there that all are advocating for this, that want to use the UDI. But if we have this number that we can associate an ID to, there's so much more we can do with this data, right? We could start looking at, there's FDA product codes and product descriptions. We could start saying, okay, FDA product code ABC is always, we're seeing an influx of recalls. So it's not so much only just let's be able to alert the hospitals, which is number one, but what is all this other stuff that we could do with it after the math? So Guillermo and I will be on a soapbox for the next 5-10 minutes here, but I can tell you that it was disappointing, number one, because FDA is the one that implemented and advocated and mandated to the suppliers to use UDI, and the industry alone has spent over $1 billion implementing it. So why they wouldn't require it as part of the recalls is disappointing.
So the first time I even heard about UDI, and I know you're familiar with Karen Conway, I saw her do a presentation at the statewide ARM conference in Pennsylvania, and she was talking about exactly what you just said, all the other applications of having that, and then having all this additional information that could be attached to it. And at the time, I was entirely supporting sterile processing, which is, part of our key audience today. And I wound up connecting with her afterwards, and we worked on an article for Healthcare Purchasing News together where they did an interview with me. And we were saying essentially that one of the things that is difficult to manage for frontline technicians in sterile processing is the instructions for use for reusable medical devices. If we could house the information, and Amy's done some work on standardizing what an IFU should look like, if we used a standard structure and then that standard structure was attached to this UDI, you could really do something amazing in your ability to communicate standards for reprocessing in a very quick and efficient way. And whenever there was an update to the instructions for use, that could be a real-time update, not the piece of paper is coming. Did you update your policies and procedures and training manuals out there in the field to make sure that you made that change? So I'm also on this soapbox. I'm going to step back because I'm the host, not the guest. But that was an area, that's what got me excited, was seeing Karen talk about that and knowing the implications for clinicians on the front line.
Well, she's the queen of UDI and has done amazing work, so I'll always give her that credit. It's always amazing being in her, in a room listening to her present on this topic. What I'll also add to that on the IFU front is medical devices are packaged with one IFU in a cardboard box. We all know cardboard is not allowed in the operating room, right? That's a number one rule. So what do you think happens to that IFU for the supply? It gets opened on the dock and it gets thrown away. So once the device gets brought up into the operating room, they don't have the IFU. They've probably been trained on it, but if it's a new product, you name the different reasons, there's nowhere to go except for maybe the manufacturer website. So to have that all housed and associated with the UDI, which it very well and easily could be added to the Good ID database, is a no-brainer. Should happen.
Guillermo, your turn.
No. I mean, it's fascinating to me, right? Because it always looks like we have these disconnects in the process based on the two sides or the three sides that are working on a particular workflow. In my case, I have to say, totally agree with what Ashlea just said. At the same time, I was actually quite happy that they even finalized this guidance encouraging the use of electronic means of communication, right? Because for me, the key is, and Ashlea knows this, I'm fully supportive of UDI. I think it's something everybody should embrace, and we should make it pervasive and use it all over the place. At the same time, I kept on telling people, and I've had conversations over the last few years where I was saying, well, this is all great, but if at the end the way that they're communicating the recall to you is they're giving you, 4 pages of paper with UDIs printed on them and instructions, and on top of that it reaches you slow, that's not going to help too much, right? The whole point is use UDI and make it flow electronically in a way that becomes very easy to absorb by a provider and kind of put it into their flow. So the fact that they mentioned that, I was really happy about. Interestingly enough, there's been guidance from the FDA all the way back to 2006 talking about these things and encouraging use of electronic means of communication. I think some folks were disappointed that it was only a guidance and it wasn't enforced. I don't know if I'm fully if I fully understand this, but I believe that in order for the FDA to put it into their regulations, it needs to be approved by Congress. And so the process is much more complex. Guidance, on the other hand, is something that's a little easier for the FDA to put out there, right? Because it doesn't need Congress approval, I think.
It's the initial form of adoption. They can't get it in front of Congress unless they can get adoption. Then Congress can make an easy decision because it's essentially already done.
So I was happy for that. I totally understand the frustration with no mention of UDI, right? I think at the end of the day, these things go hand in hand. What we've done is, we're doing on our side, we're kind of doing both things. We're enabling or supporting the use of UDI and standards, and at the same time trying to compensate for the fact that some folks are not using standards. And still trying to make that data available in a standardized way. For example, we standardize on the nomenclature and the format that providers are presented with this information, right? So today, the supplier letters alerting them have all sorts of formats and all sorts of different layouts, and they call things differently, right? So now I'll be extremely happy if I didn't have to deal with that, and I could just use the standards to communicate all that information and not have to mess around with it anymore. That would be ideal, right? It would help us all.
Ultimately, we are talking very directly about patient safety in all of these scenarios. Knowing what's expired, Ashlea, to your point, using an expired product on a patient, definite no-no. Not recalling something in a timely and effective manner could result in undue harm. And I do think we have to do better. We talked a lot already about, where we're kind of missing the mark. We teed that up well with the FDA guidance and really trying to drive the industry forward, because adopting UDI and electronic means, et cetera, addresses a lot of that and makes it more fluid, I think is, a big point that you were making there, Guillermo, is quicker and more fluid and connected from all the different silos and different buckets that people receive the communications in. So, and also maybe making it publicly available in a more usable means as well. So we talked a little bit about where that opportunity is, but I want to go back. What's going right so far? Because we've talked about where we think there's a lot of opportunity. What is working right now? And you can say nothing if you want, but what is working right now as it relates to recalls and UDI?
I think the one thing that I do like that is happening today, and it's been growing over the last few years, right? But you see a lot of willingness to collaborate between providers and suppliers. There's this perception of we're in this together. We need to be partners, strategic partners, rather than you sell me something, I pay you, and off we go, right? I think even COVID probably helped us immensely in that aspect as well, right? There's a lot more thought about how do we work together to better, to better the supply chain in healthcare, to make sure that we're doing things strategically, right? So in that regard, I think things are definitely improving. I think there's a need, maybe what I would like to see is a growth or an improvement in the willingness to tackle new technologies and new things, right? I think supply chain in healthcare tends to be pretty conservative. Unsurprisingly, right? Obviously, we're dealing with patients' lives, and so it's not like you can just do things without putting a lot of thought into it. But I do think that there's a need to start figuring out how folks can take steps a little quicker and a little better. I think in our industry, we have a lot of, well, until everybody else is doing it, I'll just stay put. And I think we're at a point, especially when it comes to, expiry of products, tracking of supplies, recalls, et cetera, where we should start being a little bit more aggressive in implementing these things in the industry.
We hear a lot about high reliability in this industry. And, I would almost say we also need a high level of confidence in a way to make that not just evidence-based, but some other KPI that drives confidence to expedite implementation of new technology like you're talking about, Guillermo. Ashlea, what would you say? What's going well with UDI? And certainly you can identify some additional areas of opportunity for improvement on the heels of that.
Yeah, I can't answer on the recall side. That's just not so much my space. But as far as UDI goes, and maybe it's not just UDI, but what I think is working is we're having hospitals and we're having supply chain leaders wanting to actually look internally for the first time in a long time to say, what can I fix in my hospital today that's been this nagging problem that will also improve processes and recover costs. And from the UDI perspective, there's a lot of things you can do with that, right? You can look at vendor implant rooms. You could look at having visibility into expiration dates onto what's in your inventory and reducing the need for someone to constantly having to eye track for things, starting to actually pay attention to what's expiring. And when you have that information and you have that data, it also improves that provider-supplier relationship, which we just talked about for recalls. So I think that we're starting to see more what Guillermo said, some of that collaboration, and our supply chain leaders looking to suppliers, which I was corrected. There's a difference between a supplier and a vendor. And if Jeremy's listening, he'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But that they want people to come to the table and say, what initiatives do you have? Or suppliers come in and say, what are your initiatives this year? And how can my technology, my service, my product fit into that? Versus coming and saying, let me sell you something. And so I just think that there's, this willingness of maybe I'll try something small. I agree with Guillermo that technology is always the scariest one because they've been burned from, having a 6-month project plan that took 18 months to implement. But I do think that there's an awareness of there's opportunity within, my department, my silo to improve and improve processes and what's a small step I can take.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it is everybody contributing to it. And you're actually almost reading my mind because that's one of those questions that we always ask is how can the people in the audience really take this forward? What can they do to play their part? If they see the importance of UDI as it relates to patient safety, how can they increase awareness within their organizations? How can they get involved? What's something that they can do on a day-to-day basis that would really help us push this industry forward? We'll stay with you, Ashlea, first on that.
Yeah, I think asking, there's always these questions that I love. It's the first question I ask to any person, which is, tell me what lot numbers do we have? What lot numbers do we have in our supply core, or tell me what items are expiring? And I think that it is a thought-provoking question to ask, because now that you know what UDI is, if your manager says, well, we don't have that information, our software doesn't do it, you now are empowered to be able to say, well, there's this barcode, and there are technologies out there that can read this information to give us visibility into lot numbers, give us visibility into expiration dates, so that we know what products may be recalling or what products might be short-dated.
Guillermo, what would you add, from the recall perspective, although that was tied together nicely? I think Ashlea set you up very well. But what are some things that, frontline clinicians can do to, make that day-to-day improvement or push this industry forward? I mean, I think you described one thing. No nurse wants to go and check lot numbers all the day long, that's for sure. So
right.
Pointing out that there may be a better way to do that, but just managing recalls in general, how can people help us, make a difference here?
I think that there's probably two things I would point out. I think internally at a provider, the one thing that would help a lot is when you present, the C-suite with stats and some facts about kind of the activity that goes on today when a provider deals with recalls. It might shed a little bit of light and give awareness to the challenges presented, right? In other words, I think sometimes that it's almost like this balance folks want to play between telling the folks upstairs, we have challenges and we wish we could do something about it. And at the same time, they also want to be able to tell them we're doing everything we can with the means and resources we have today, right? So in that regards, I think presenting some more information would be good, because right now it ends up being, like I mentioned earlier, a little bit of an esoteric process for the folks in the C-suite that then think, well, we got it covered. There's a process and somebody's taking care of it, and I don't hear anything about this, so it must be good. That's one thing. I think the other one is having clinicians, for example, and other stakeholders in the process question how things are done. For example, it's not uncommon to see somebody in risk management, for example, saying, well, if we need to look at 4,000 alerts, even though only 400 affect us, that's what we're going to do to ensure that the patient is safe. I understand the concept. At the same time, you start thinking about alert fatigue, and we're all human beings, right? And by the time you've done this for the 300th time this month, right, there's a little chip in the brain that starts switching on and off. Right. So I think that those are things that we really need to have these stakeholders think a little more outside the box and say, while if a robot, an algorithm were to do this, this would be perfectly safe. By us doing it this way, are we really perfectly safe? And I'll give you one last example of that. If people are matching to PO history, which is what I call fuzzy logic matching, right? It's not 100% accurate. It's about 80% in the best case accurate. Then what ends up happening is you don't have a fail-safe process. You think you do, but you don't. And that happens all the time. This is happening everywhere, right? It's the best that providers could do up to this point, but I think it's time to change that. And folks need to think a little bit outside the box. I think any clinician, at least, or risk manager, or value analysis staff that puts those questions on the table and starts asking, are we really doing the best we can be doing? Or should we start thinking about doing things differently? I think that helps, right? If not, inertia kicks in and we keep doing the same thing the same way forever. Goes for suppliers too, by the way, right? If you think about it, they've been alerting providers about recalls in the same way for 40 years. It hasn't changed a bit, right?
All right, we have a question from the chat, so this may be the last question before we do some final thoughts and wrap up what's been a very informative and engaging session here towards the end of the Expert Series conference that's been going all day today. So here goes from Brian in the chat. For IDNs that use systems that do not have UDI capabilities on the supply chain side, how do you see this integrating? Is it standalone or bolt-on and driven by the manufacturers and distributors?
I think I should probably take this one. So I'll start with the first part of it. There are some, just for the record, there are some systems out there that do leverage UDI. So, there's Epic has, it just depends on, just like everything, what version of the technology you have. So that would be a first step question. Obviously, this person doesn't have that. So in that case, then I would say you would look at the bolt-on. And it all depends on the area too, right? So your supply chain area may use one type of technology. You might have something separate that's very specific to recalls, and you might have something that's totally different for the SPD, depending on what problem you're trying to solve with it. But it doesn't always have to be bolt-on either, right? Sometimes trying to add into or run APIs into other softwares aren't the best opportunity. And so there's also, standalone systems that will allow you just to go in, inventory your entire supply core and have visibility into, what's there in that point in time.
I would add, Ashlea, that when it comes to recalls, and Brian, hello, and thank you for the question because it's a good one. When it comes to recalls, I think the key is what Brian is mentioning is true. If a particular provider cannot today handle UDI for whatever the reason, and they haven't moved to a, either an ERP version that does or some other system, there is at least a way for recalls to be improved, or the source, if you will, of the feed of recalls to be improved. And it's because you can rely on the manufacturer's batch lot data information. In other words, they have shipment information that deals with understanding who got what when, and so that obviously improves it. It doesn't solve the problem, obviously. It's not the final answer, right? There's other challenges, but it does improve to what providers are doing today, I would say.
All right, so we're going to get your final thoughts. And as we wrap up, just a couple of minutes left, Guillermo, we'll go ahead and stay with you on this one. But what is something that we just haven't covered today that everybody should know about recalls and alerts?
I would point out probably one or two things. One that I think as human beings affect us all is that we've estimated that today we're chopping 500,000 trees a year to notify providers of recalls, right? So it's paper being sent all over the place.
What's the cost of that?
It's insane. It's you're talking about, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, but not only that, it's a cost to the environment. Think about the carbon footprint from all of the FedEx planes and trucks. Nothing against FedEx or UPS, obviously, but it's a lot, right? We're at home trying to recycle and getting rid of plastic straws and doing other things like that because we want to do good, right? And then we maintain these kind of processes. So that's one. So anybody that's concerned for the environment should be trying to figure out ways to help in this madness, right? And I think the other one is providers specifically, when they talk to suppliers, should be making them very much aware of the fact that the current process is not something that makes them happy. I think that there's also been a lack of communicating that sometimes. So a lot of suppliers sometimes are not fully aware that their clients are actually unhappy about this part of the process.
All right, Ashlea, your final thoughts. What about UDI is important for the audience to know that we didn't talk about today?
That it's not just a barcode. I think that we look at it as, this thing that we scan, but that there's so much data that's behind it that can be leveraged throughout the hospital to improve processes, reduce costs, recall alerts. So by implementing even, to Brian's point, a bolt-on or a standalone system as a first step is going to empower the hospital to start making data-driven decisions in ways they've never been able to do it before.
Yeah, fantastic. The two of you are amazing experts on our series. You're very complimentary as a panel. This might be the standard by which all future panels go by. And I'll also say, really have enjoyed having you on the podcast. And I know both of you are going to have a vendor spotlight coming out here later in the coming months. But I just want to thank you both for coming on. Ashlea, so much for shining a light on UDI and trying to get people outside of supply chain to really understand its importance as well. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
And Guillermo, you too, as far as the recalls go, very important point that you made right at the end there about the cost of the environment. So thanks for joining us in the panel today.
Always a pleasure to be surrounded by passionate people like you both.
All right, Melanie, we're going to hand it back to you to wrap up the session. And I want to just say thank you to everybody in the audience who's been supporting all the great work that we're doing at Power Supply with great partners like Guillermo and Ashlea that joined us today.
Yeah, thank you for this, another really good panel discussion. I know Guillermo mentioned passion, but y'all's passion was dripping out of the computer screen as I was listening to this presentation. And being the OR clinician on the other end of those recall alerts and all that information, and I am the one digging through the pile looking for the correct lot numbers, I can really feel the need for things to be improved and to get better. For sure. But loved your passion and loved the insight that you added to this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.